And Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe says there's no cholera outbreak in his country. And those words come despite the World Health Organization's estimate that at least 780 people have died so far, and more than 16,000 have the disease. Well, for more on that, I'm joined by Zimbabwean broadcaster Lance Guma. Lance, crisis, what crisis? Cholera, what cholera? I mean, if Mugabe was on the street in Britain, he'd be taken into care.
Yeah,
he'd be put away.
It's quite sad that an 84-year-old liberation war icon can embarrass himself in this particular manner and deny something that the whole world is seeing with their own eyes. Over 800 people dead, over 16,000 infected. But I think it's no surprise that he has gone into default mode and really decided to deny that cholera is still a problem. And it's interesting, his definition of the crisis is that it's Browns Cholera. He's blaming Britain for this cholera crisis.
Well, he's obsessed with blaming Britain. Yeah. I mean, he's been assessed for years, so we just ignore stuff like that. Yeah. He also mentioned Sarkozy as well. But all this sort of criticism is meant, or the saying there's no crisis, is meant to deflect international pressure, isn't it?
I think in this particular case, it's very embarrassing for them to admit that they've failed as a government. So this becomes a convenient escape to find someone else to blame. And I think Mugabe has been doing this consistently, blaming the West for Zimbabwe's problems. But I think the bottom line is you have a government that was voted out in March by the people of Zimbabwe. And 9 months later, that illegitimate government is hanging on to power. And this is why we have the crisis.
So what's next, Lance? I mean, the West did talk about sanctions. The UN talked about sanctions, as you know, sort of in the summer, July. But Russia and I think China voted against those sanctions. That can't possibly happen again. So the UN is meeting as a special session on Monday. What action do you see coming out of that, if any?
Well, I do admit that nothing is likely to come from the UN in terms of military action, but I think there has been a ratcheting up of pressure, and Mugabe in responding...
Not necessarily military action. I'm thinking perhaps sanctions, because that's what China and Russia were against in July.
Yeah, we've had these targeted sanctions for quite some time, and I'm not sure an extension of what we already have in terms of targeting companies aligned to Mugabe and individuals aligned to Mugabe. I'm not sure whether that on its own will bring a solution. But I think Africa as a continent has been very disappointing, and I think it's time for Africa as a continent to step up to the plate and say, if we are to embrace democracy, we have to embrace it with all its facets and not make exceptions for people who have lost elections. I think what happened in Kenya was a very bad precedent where you have someone losing an election but they still stay in power. And the same thing is happening again in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, the problem is, I mean, we always talk, or you're talking in generalities now. Let's get specific. What could an African country do apart from sending troops into Zimbabwe and removing him physically? What apparatus is there to affect any kind of regime change?
I think if I may quote Botswana's Foreign Affairs Minister Pandu Skelemani, who suggested that a simple thing like a border blockade by the SADC regional countries would, in essence, lead to the collapse of the Zimbabwe government. I mean, without any fuel supplies, really, they couldn't function. So I think it is things like that which can bring pressure. And of course, the attitude of superpowers like South Africa, I think, would be instrumental in getting Mugabe to reform. I think so far South Africa have acted as if they're in a political Disneyland. And I've described the assessment of the Zimbabwe situation as a Mickey Mouse assessment. If the South Africans also stepped up to the plate, I think they have sufficient stamina to force Mugabe's hand, but they're not doing so. We only have Botswana and Kenya to a large extent doing that. And more African countries have to speak out.
I think many in the world would completely support what you're saying there, Lance. Thanks very much for joining us.